Hey, welcome to Beer Christianity. My name is Jonty, and you'll hear Melky and Laura shortly as we interview the wonderful Brian McLaren. It's an interview we did at Greenbelt Festival 2024, but before we get to that, I want to tell you something ridiculously exciting. This is the official announcement that we are starting a magazine. It's called Shibboleth, that's Shibboleth, and it's got some of the stuff you love about Beer Christianity, but it's also got a whole bunch more. I've been working with Melky and Laura on it, but Drabs, I Will Remember You, has also written an incredibly funny and helpful piece for it, as has Liz Coolidge-Jenkins from episode 87, if you remember, and Bella from episode 99. And a whole bunch of other people to fill 80 pages for issue 1 of the magazine. Shibboleth will be a print-only magazine, but we will have a few samples at the website, shibbolethmag.com, so you can get a flavor of what it's about if you're unsure. But we basically want to make Shibboleth a magazine for people who are deconstructing their faith, those who are reconstructing their faith, and anyone who feels spiritually unhoused or politically unhoused in the church. We also want to make you laugh inappropriately, obviously. So if you want faith without the baggage, justice without caveats on both siding, or entertainment without whatever it is you don't like about entertainment, then head to shibbolethmag.com. Check it out. Like, you could, I don't know, order, you could subscribe. We're still getting some stuff kind of sorted out in terms of distribution, but you can already do all that stuff. And you can get a flavor of what it is and maybe share it with friends who you think might be interested. But yeah, you can order now. Basically, we're hoping to release it in early December, the first issue, and you can expect queer-friendly, left-leaning news, reviews, features, interviews with a broad Christian or Christian-adjacent slant, plus we've got stuff on faith heroes, liberation heroes, we've got columns about sex and columns about feminism and columns about art, we've got a column about mental health, we've got stories about Christians doing good stuff in the world, we've got queer Christian stories. So if you're bored or you're frustrated with the representations of Christianity you see in the media around you, then head over to shibbolethmag.com and order your copy today. Part of the Beer Christianity family. No, I don't know what we're going to be calling it. But yeah, and yeah, that's all I really have to say about that, except we're ridiculously excited. It's going to be very cool. A lot of people have worked very hard to make it possible, and I think you're going to enjoy it. I really do. So yeah, if you could make it financially viable by buying it, that'd be amazing. We're selling it for 10 quid an issue, which I don't think is bad for an 80-page magazine put together for free. So yeah, I don't know if you could. Is it for free? I don't know. That's not true. Anyway, go check it out. Tell us what you think, and yeah, spread the word. Okay. That's enough of that. Now you can get back to Brian McLaren at Greenbelt. Thank you, Greenbelt, for making this possible and also for making the magazine possible. You know what you did. And yeah, here we go. Brian, thanks so much for joining us. We've been thinking and talking, the three of us, quite a lot about living ethically. It's a lot of what I think Christians are talking about and always have been. And especially now in a time when we've become more ideologically aware, and there's this movement talking about how there is no ethical consumption under capitalism because everything has a supply chain that is tainted with some kind of unethical behavior. An older form of Christianity might have offered us guilt or a kind of hopeless complacency.
Yes.
The new kind of Christianity that you are kind of a figurehead for, does it offer something else in that kind of situation? A guidance that wouldn't just make us feel terrible about ourselves or say, well, there's nothing we can do.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think your question is so thoughtfully framed because we have an ethical problem, but the thinking we do about that ethical problem is a problem too. Many of us only have the mental skills or habits to say something is good or bad, pure or impure, acceptable, unacceptable. A lot of people refer to that as dualistic thinking. We have two bins that we throw everything into, and we feel we've done our moral job, heretical, orthodox, you know, whatever the polarity is, we make our choice. And I'm sad to say that an awful lot, it's not just Christianity, it's the fundamentalist wing and the institutional wing of almost any religious group and any political or economic or whatever group. This is what they tend to do. They operate on they feel very righteous because they're always judging other things unrighteous, but it's really very somewhat immature and easy level. So you move beyond that and you think, okay, I have to get up tomorrow. How am I going to live? And when we get to the point where we realize that the same critique that we could keep levying on other people could then be turned on us, suddenly we're humbled, and if we're fortunate, we're thrown into a whole different world where instead of being judging right or wrong, pure, impure, we're thinking, how can I do a little better tomorrow? And what's going to make a difference? What are the virtues that I'd like to show up with in this ethical mess that we're in? And this isn't just a new problem, in my country, we see, of course, many people are denying this, but more white people are trying to see our history in light of genocide and enslavement. And it's easy to then say, oh, the people in the South who had slaves, they're guilty, and the people in the North are innocent. But of course, the people in the North were making all of their money turning the cotton into clothing and cloth that they, by the way, also sent over here on this side of the pond. Mm-hmm. And in some way, we start to see the whole system is filled with trouble. And that's happening in the economics, in the ecological crisis that we face, which your question, I'm summarizing the wisdom of your question. And here's where we face a need for additional maturity. The solutions we need, each of us can make individual changes. I think we should. I don't think we should do it with guilt or neurosis, because our bigger problem is the systems that we built over centuries. So what we have to do is, I think, be able to critique the systems while we live in them and begin to do the things that reduce harm within these systems. And then I think simultaneously we have to dare to imagine new systems that could replace our existing systems. One more thing I'll say. I believe he's Czech, right? The Czech philosopher Slavoj Žižek said not too long ago, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism.
Yeah.
And I think what he was saying is our brains, our minds, our theologies, our daily habits, everything about us has been shaped by capitalism in ways that we aren't even aware of. And this is a profoundly spiritual and just essential imaginative task for us to imagine ways of living that are outside of what's even conceivable right now.
And I feel like there's so much talk in the left political sphere and stuff like that, saying exactly that. It's the system,
Yeah.
and that's what's the problem. But we have built a system on all of the things that have gone before us, and it's really hard to. First, we have to recognize that, but also it's so hard to get away with that. We can say, "Oh, yeah, it's the system, it's the problem," till the cows come home.
Yes,
but that's not changing the system. But also, I don't know how we change that system, because all we have ever done is build on what has been before. So how do we navigate that?
Yeah. There's a Black American sage named Maya Angelou, and Maya said, "You do the best that you know, and then when you know better, you do better." Mm-hmm. Well, I in the big scheme of things, first, another really insightful question. If I can tell a quick story, I wrote a book way back 2007 called Everything Must Change. And when I wrote that book, at the end of my research, I felt I was at a fork in the road. And I just maybe have 2 sentences in the book where I mentioned this, but I felt I couldn't talk a lot about it. First, because I didn't know what to say. And second, because I felt it would suck all the air out of the room. But what I realized in the activist community, there was a fork in the road that went like this. One road said, let's try to make the global economy incrementally better. Let's try to reduce harm. Let's try to improve. Let's try to change. Let's try to make incremental changes to the global economy. Then there was another group of people who I met and I was in meetings with, and they just said, that's ridiculous. It will never happen. The system's unreformable. And they said, this system will collapse. Now, at the time, I'm being honest, I felt they said that a little glibly, like, if the system collapses, how many people die? 1 billion, 2 billion? How does it collapse? How much damage does it do to the earth if that collapse involves nuclear war, right? But they said the system will collapse and something new will grow up in the rubble. And they said, our focus is to try to pioneer and experiment with the kinds of things that could spring up after a collapse. And here it is all these years later, and I don't know which of those two roads we'll take. I think it's a mistake for people on either road to critique the other people. I think the truth is we need people who devote themselves to making the current economic system less harmful to the environment, less harmful to the poor, less harmful to women, less harmful to minorities, just less harmful. And to try to adapt it and make changes and bring new laws and incrementally change it in hopes that it can turn better. And whether that works or not, it makes sense to have people doing the imagination to say, what's something better than we can even imagine, because our imaginations are fenced in by the assumptions of capitalism.
I've heard you talking, comparing our culture's kind of obsession with that way of thinking that we've talked about with addiction.
Yeah.
And actually it tracks in terms of how do you help an addicted loved one? Do you try and chip away, keep them in the room, or wait for a rock bottom, wait for an explosion for them to realize? But so that's really interesting, focusing on the rehab. So what's inspired you in terms of the rehabilitation, the reimagining? What are the tangible things that, this is a new way of thinking, or a way to frame things, even the values?
In this new book that I just wrote, I have a chapter called Hope is Complicated, and one of the things I notice is that whenever people bring up a positive story, I watch my own brain and other brains go, oh, okay, we don't need to worry. So I want to share a couple positive stories, but I want to say, watch your brain. And if your brain tells you we don't need to worry, that's your brain working against you. That's a cognitive bias in play. But the good news is that what people couldn't have imagined 20 years ago, 25 years ago, people have just set out to work in 1,000 different ways. Let me just, for example, obviously battery technology. Nobody would have guessed we would have made the progress in battery technology we made. Solar panels and solar energy. And there's new breakthroughs being made constantly. Just recently I was reading about this new breakthrough of this micro thin, it's almost like a paint that could be put on things to capture solar energy. Incredible scientific breakthroughs. Agriculture, one of the 5 biggest areas of trouble in relation to climate change. Amazing innovations being done. I talked to agriculturalists who said we have about 10,000 years of practice in the agriculture of annual plants that grow and die every year. We just never got around to thinking about what could be done with perennial plants. And so there's this whole field of selective breeding of perennial plants as potential food crops. And because universities and other research facilities can coordinate their efforts, they're accelerating the speed of us discovering incredible new things, and then throw in some genetic engineering, and which people have a lot of different opinions about genetically modified foods. But what's being done? There are things being done that are fascinating in improving plant yields or improving the role of fungi in creating healthy soil ecosystems. I mean, the breakthroughs are incredible. Community organizing, architecture. it's inspiring. Here's the problem, though. Another brilliant living person, Bayo Akomolafe, the Nigerian philosopher, said, what if our response to the problem is part of the problem? In other words, what if the assumptions that are built into the way that we come up with great solutions, we implement them in ways that perpetuate the problem? And that's why I just think all of us have to get used to a deep both and. Let's improve the current system. At the same time, we acknowledge the current system may be one of the things we need to not just improve, but outgrow. And what that could mean, let's just, as an example, what if the future economy needed to not be based on money? What if we need to what if nonviolence actually doesn't become sort of icing on the cake, but what if nonviolence becomes the way of life that's required on many levels? And so our most important work becomes, how do we educate people and nourish self-regulation so that our own internal tensions don't result in violence, and so that we don't create systems that perpetuate violence that we don't care about? I mean, what if, for example, in a capitalistic society, creativity, hard work, self-discipline, these are essential qualities, and good qualities, I'd say. But what if the quality of empathy turns out to be so important, and we have virtually no infrastructure to teach empathy? When we start asking those kinds of questions, I think we start to imagine that, as Arundhati Roy has said, that another world is possible, and on a quiet day I can hear her breathing.
I think a lot of that, you were talking about the systemic change that would need to happen, whether that's a collapse or, as some people would say, a revolution or any of that kind of stuff. When you start thinking about that, there's a tension at play, or something at play that we often talk about as the hot take industrial complex.
Yes.
As soon as there's something that people like, a revered heroic figure from history, there's going to be an influencer out there, an article, an op-ed in a newspaper telling you why they're actually terrible, because it's something new to say within the media. Similarly with alternative systems, how do we find our way past that? Because, I'm wearing a Karl Marx t-shirt here. I think there's a lot in Marxist stuff. There's a lot of anarchists out there who would say, but for every one of those systems, you're going to have people going like, well, I don't know, because I heard about this one time when it was bad. How do we move ourselves past that of being like excited by this new hot take? And as a society move past that?
I mean, this is one of our great communication problems. And I think it probably requires three things that don't come easily, I think one is humility. We have to have the humility to be willing for others to think we're fools. Because sometimes you have to say something for 20 or 30 or 50 or 200 years and have people think you're a fool over many generations for people to finally realize, hey, they were right, So there's humility. I think there's grace, because it's so easy to then, you become angry at these people for not getting it. And then what they feel from you is resentment. And nobody wants to learn from someone who they feel resents them, right? So I think there's a certain kind of grace that we need in that. But and then there's courage and persistence to keep at it and keep looking for new ways to say it. I find I wasn't this way, and maybe this is one of those things that just depends on who we are and what stage we are in life. But I used to bend over backwards to make sure I could get my ideas a fair hearing. And what I find happens more often now is I just say the idea. And I understand people are going to freak out and judge and make fun of and all the rest. And if I can get a chance, I'll say, here's the idea. And then I'll say, and you might think that's ridiculous, and you might think I'm a fool, and you might think I'm naive. And if you walk away and think that, that'll be the end of the conversation. If you're curious, I may have actually thought about the things you're saying, or you're saying to yourself, and we could talk about it. So I try to make it possible to have a conversation. But I suppose the change in my tactic is to say, I expect this to be unacceptable. It would be unacceptable to me if I were sitting where you're sitting. So I'm going to let it be unacceptable, but then see if you have the curiosity. I personally think that's why Jesus spoke in parables. Parables were ways of saying unacceptable things in a story form that then let people grapple with it a little bit and then decide if they wanted to ask a question.
I mean, that does sound like you're going through life as a secure rather than deeply insecure person. I don't know if I'm on board with that, actually. That's no way to live, right?
Well, I'm as insecure as anybody else, but I guess you get punished by your own insecurity long enough. You learn a few things, maybe.
Yeah, and I think part of that is, I think we've been doing a lot of thinking about how on the right side of things, and certainly in the kind of evangelical church in America, I think there was this kind of idea of a one-fix-all situation of like, well, Trump will get in and it'll fix everyone.
Oh my gosh,
but I think actually the same thing does exist on the left. I just don't think the left can decide on which one thing that they are.
They're too busy fighting each other, to be honest, to really decide on one thing.
But I think when there is an individual level of like, well, if we can do this one thing, then it's all we're all going to fix that. And how do we work in that in that environment? How do we navigate kind of just defeating that idea of one thing is going to fix everything?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, what comes to mind when you say that is we probably need to resurrect some wise old sayings that we just bring out at those times. Right. But, someone says something, and I have a friend, someone says something, and he says, people say a lot of things. And it's just his way of saying, everybody has opinions. And I just think, it's a tricky situation we're in. And in a certain way, I think we're at the point where so many of us spend more time on social media that social media communication habits are guiding our in-person communication habits. I feel all of our in-person communication, we're going to have to figure out ways to remind one another that we can actually have a conversation, and instead of going to agreement, disagreement, we can go to curiosity and questions and further explanation and that sort of thing.
Going to that, we mentioned Trump, going to the concrete example of American politics right now. And you were talking about not throwing away the incremental change. In a situation where, and I understand this because you come from the evangelical church, you understand how destructive it can be to demand purity from leaders, right?
Yes.
But we can also understand how hard it would be for somebody to think of Kamala Harris as a harm reduction candidate if they were Palestinian.
Yes.
How do we navigate that? Because that's not just utopian thinking versus pragmatism. That's two very competing, a real genocide, real suffering happening right now, deeply involved with somebody who is being called harm reduction by good people who are moving for positive progress. It seems so depressing.
Well, let me first say something that I'm not sure is true. So if someone wants to argue with me, I'm not saying this is true. This is a question, something I wonder about. I've spent a bit of time in Palestine, and Palestinians have been suffering for so long at the hands of so many people that I think they would be the Palestinians I know would not be quick to say it doesn't matter, that Kamala Harris is not good enough, because their suffering has been so great and it's been so intractable. I'm just remembering conversations I've had when I was in the West Bank from people who their whole lives had been spent in a refugee camp. and their parents had lived in refugee camps most of their lives. And the feeling I had from them was, look, anything that helps is good. I sometimes fear that this is maybe a fault on the left, that the left thinks there's quick fixes, and they just think the right is wrong, and all they need is the chance to get their quick fix in. Very often the people in the middle of these situations are far more realistic than their allies, who passionately care, but bring all of their own assumptions. I'm not sure that's true, but it's worth thinking about. But at the end of the day, I just think nothing is ever fixed. This idea that we could fix anything, the way that you fix today's problem becomes your problem tomorrow. It's always a process. And that's why, again, moving beyond this, you're my friend, you're my enemy, to say, we need to build all the allies we can in all the ways we can, allies with whom we agree on 80%, or we disagree on 80%, but agree on 20%, and we can work together on this issue. That kind of thinking, I just think, is pragmatically so essential. And I also understand that there are some people whose job it is to be angry and unsatisfied at every moment, and they are fulfilling a function too. I consider them part of the team too.
But do you think it is being angry and unsatisfied to say, you just sent another $30 billion to Israel for weapons in an ongoing genocide of my people? Because there are a lot of Palestinians who are very angry about that at the Biden-Harris administration. I don't know if that is being unpragmatic. The most pragmatic thing would be, please stop sending them money. We're not asking you to invade Israel. We're asking you to stop funding our death.
I totally agree with that sentiment. The problem is, what happens when your choice is Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, and those are your only two choices. And if there was a choice who was advocating that, and you knew that person would not get elected, and the person who got elected would make things worse, right? This is the realities we face. But that's not to say I don't dismiss the people who are furious about that. We all should be furious that those are our only choices. I have, because I was a pastor in the Washington, D.C. area, I've had a lot of people in my life who were in various places of government. And one of them worked for the State Department, and he had just retired before October 7th. And he and I have been on the phone quite a few times, and he and former members of the State Department and current members of the State Department are working tirelessly to send pressure up the chain, because they were livid about the stupidity of the Biden and Harris administration in their initial responses. So,
what time are we at?
We're at 24 minutes and it's 3:30.
Okay, cool. Further questions from you guys before we move into the second?
Sorry, so questions on this part? What we're moving on to?
Just any other questions before we move on to the section about deconstruction as a kind of movement? All my stuff's on deconstruction. That's where you. Okay, well then, if we can do, I'm not trying to hog the mic by any means. You're kind of the figurehead of the deconstructing Christian movement. How do you feel about that?
Well, maybe not to call you old, but maybe for people of a certain age.
I am old.
But I think there's a lot of younger people who have never heard of me, and this thing has certainly taken on a life of its own. I remember I had a book come out called A New Kind of Christian, and that book, I think, played a big role in creating space where people could have needed conversations. And I actually framed the book. It was written as a fictional story. I framed it as a conversation because it wasn't a matter of an argument that was needed. We actually needed space where people could ask questions and talk and listen and all the rest. All I hoped for was a hearing. And so I would have to say the way that has taken off in these years goes beyond what I really imagined. I'd say two things have happened. The spread of that deconstructing, questioning movement has gone far beyond what I would have guessed. And I continually have surprises. I've had this brilliant young woman from Nigeria emailing me, and to hear the kind that these discussions are happening among Pentecostals in Nigeria. Some years ago, I was in Argentina, and I was with all of these youth workers from across South America and Central America. And the caliber of the discussion they were having was far beyond what I'd seen in the US or Europe. So the fact that this has gone farther, but the institutional church has been far worse than I would have expected. It wasn't like the institutional church was going to stay steady and we were going to challenge it. Watching the multifaceted deterioration has been very sad. So it's hard to feel happy, but it is possible, I think, to feel that if there weren't this questioning movement, we would even be more depressed.
Because you can feel tempted to ask the question, like a lot of people are deconstructing and they're becoming a different kind of Christian, a new kind of Christian,
Yes.
But but some people go through deconstruction and leave the church.
Yes.
And I think a lot of the conservatives I know are like, that's the problem with this deconstruction movement.
Yes.
And don't seem to recognize that those people are leaving the church. They're not leaving deconstruction.
Yes. I remember once years ago, a Southern Baptist guy came up to me and said, look, you need to know this. I was just in a Southern Baptist meeting, and they're going to blame you for all the people leaving Christianity. and I said, well, I wasn't surprised at all, right? But yeah, I mean, here's what I'd say. The Christian religion in its current form does not deserve to keep its younger generations. More are staying than the religion deserves by its behavior. So I'm not surprised they're complaining. Look, I live in a country where a billionaire whines and complains every day. Maybe he's a billionaire, I'm not sure. But you would think billionaires are the worst off people in the world, the way you hear him complain. And so this is just a sad reality. We humans are capable of a lot of self-pity and blaming other people for our problems. A lot of people are leaving, and a lot of the people who leave are becoming wonderful people, just as many of these people who are staying are becoming more wonderful people even than they were before. And a lot just suffer because they haven't found anyone to help them. And I'm going to guess that's probably why you guys are doing what you're doing right now, and it's why I'm doing what I'm doing, is we want to help everybody, inside or outside, to get on a path that leads to more joy and more life and more kindness.
When you look back at your work from those early days when you were kind of a lone voice to now, is there any things that you look back and cringe on or think, oh man, why did I go that way? And what stuff are you particularly proud of?
We'd like you to just relive them.
Any of those past traumas.
Yeah, just bring them up now.
Yeah, and I'll need a bit of therapy after.
We were sent by the Southern Baptist.
Oh my. So the first thing I should say is I was not alone for very long. I wrote my first book and I thought I'm going to lose all my friends. It took a bit of courage. And then when that book came out, people started coming out of the woodwork and just saying, I thought I was the only one. And then suddenly, so I didn't ever feel, I felt alone very, very seldom. And the friendships that emerged in those times have been incredibly rich, staying power. I bumped into 2 or 3 people today who I haven't seen in many years, and we just picked up where we left off from those days. So nothing but good to say. And I imagine you would feel the same about one another and people you know. I think there's something when we venture into new territory and we find kindred spirits, even if we don't solve the problems we're trying to solve, we gain these precious relationships. So that's something I'm very glad about. I'm lucky. I didn't start writing books until I was in my 40s. I think I was 42 or 43. And so if I'd started writing books when I was 30, I'd have a lot more to cringe about. But I started late enough. There are a few sentences here and there, but I also feel, I think everybody feels this way who writes over a long period of time. You realize I wrote what I wrote there to solve a problem that I was really having. And that book helped me and other people work through that problem. I don't have that problem anymore. So when I go back and look at it, I wouldn't write that book again because that's not where I am now. So I'm glad I wrote it then. I helped solve some problems then. And I hope I can be gracious to my own previous self in that way. I try to be that way to other people.
I'm interested to know how you see kind of the future of these kind of new Christian communities. I think we've chatted a bit on the podcast of how these guys both kind of grew up in kind of more conservative Christian, came from more conservative Christian backgrounds, and have had to go through quite a significant kind of deconstruction to be where you guys are today. I've not had the same sort of thing. I've kind of been able to escape a lot of the harmful side of things, which I'm quite obviously very grateful for. But I think now that people like you who are having kids and raising your kids to have kind of more open ideas about stuff, there's going to be, I think, a whole new generation of people who aren't having to go through that really serious deconstruction of like, oh, these are really harmful things that we were taught. How do you see that occurring in the future?
Well, another great question. So you all probably know I've for several years been working very closely with Richard Rohr, and Richard and I have been friends for almost 25 years, maybe 25 years now. And Richard always talked about first half of life and second half of life. And I remember 15 years ago, maybe, I said to him, we were having dinner one night, I said, Richard, I think what you're saying about first half of life, second half of life is true of baby boomers. But I think future generations are going to be, their parents, if their parents go to the second half of life before their children turn into teenagers, they will bring their children to where they are much faster. And I think this will be a different time pattern. And I try to explain this. I modified what Richard was saying a little bit. I'd written a book called Faith After Doubt. So I talk about 4 stages, and I think people can reach those stages much earlier. And I also think that we don't have them yet, but we could have teachers and educational systems that had greater understanding of how stages of intellectual, moral, social development affect our ability to learn. And when that happens, we're going to be in a very, very new situation. That may well be one of the breakthroughs that helps contribute to the next way of life that we need.
You were talking about the questions that you were answering with your old books. I think a lot of the kind of entrenched fundamentalist Christianity and even traditional Christianity that we've seen, the dogmas that are taught and kind of are the structures around which a church is based, they're answering questions that were really hot in the 16th century, were really hot, 400 years after Christ. These are the important things. Is there a danger that we will define everything with this new movement in exactly the same way with these old questions? And how do we guard against that?
So there's something that I think is a shift in thinking that more and more people are having. Let me get a little nerdy and technical for just a minute. If you want a term for this, it's called process philosophy and process theology. And the biggest thing that you can say about this shift is if you start with the idea, here's the way I say it. If you start with the idea that things are real and change happens to them, you get the world that we have. But if you start with the idea change is real and things emerge and pass away over time, interesting. The world looks very different. And the scientific worldview that people inherited up to my parents' generation and my generation was things are real and change happens to them. But I think more and more children, the world that they move into from science, from politics, from art, from music, is that change is real and things come and go in time, right? I have a feeling that it will take more and more work to resist seeing the fundamental reality of change. And when that happens, I just think as that becomes more pervasive and we're juggling less of the leftovers of that old world, things will be different. I have a feeling that problem will solve itself, except that the people who want to keep the old worldview will use weapons and money and vicious words and whatever else, because it's the only world they can imagine. And they're making a lot of money and they get a lot of power and status in that world. So you can see why they'd be afraid of that.
And the reaction that will get from some people will also be the unhelpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think there's a chapter in your book, Hope is Complicated.
Yes.
What are the things, or who are the people that inspire you to keep that hope and keep going and to do nothing rather than, to do something rather than nothing.
To do nothing rather than something. Well, here's the thing. There are so many, and there are so few people who oppose it. But the few people who oppose it have a lot of wealth and power. As I said a minute ago, they have a lot to gain and a lot to lose. So they use their wealth and power to keep their gains. There's an old saying that a conservative is a person who has a lot to conserve. I don't know how many people, I hope not many did, because just watching this lowered your IQ by about 20 points. But Elon Musk and Donald Trump had a 2-hour conversation.
And was it 2 hours?
And it was just like, it was stunning idiocy by the world's richest, or one of the richest individuals, and one of the most notorious and powerful and beloved by some people. So at any rate, there are a few of these people who have enormous influence, and there are lots and lots of people who just want to be good neighbors and who just want to do the right thing. And so the struggle of my hope isn't a matter of numbers, it's a matter of power. And I suppose this is a very dark thing to say, but that power, I know, is suicidal. And they will limit themselves. It's just a question of how much harm they do to all the rest of us and the earth itself in the process of their project failing. Their project cannot succeed. They have built a project that's dependent on exploiting more and more cheap energy. And if they do that, they destroy themselves. And if they don't do that, their project fails. So that might not sound like it's very hopeful, but it is hopeful in a certain way,
And so this sounds like, as someone who grew up with original sin and total depravity, it sounds like your starting point then is original goodness, is that we, it kind of free, if we're liberated or free, then we, in our natural state, are hopeful and optimistic and loving, and it's the powerful forces from without that cause the trouble. Would that be fair?
Well, I would much prefer original goodness to an original blessing to original depravity and so on. Yeah, but ultimately, I'm just to be honest, I don't think I think that way. Because I'm thinking more evolutionarily, I think life wants to grow. Life wants to diversify. Life wants to become more beautiful, and so that's the arc. But bad stuff happens, and things can go wrong, and asteroids hit planets, and people discover coal and oil and have no idea that the more they use it, the richer they'll get and the worse the planet will be, until eventually they face a catastrophe. So to me, if I look at it in terms of we should desire wisdom, we should desire collaboration, we should desire these things, and my hope is that they could lead us to a better place. Yeah.
For people who, and we all know some of these people who have grown up in the church, maybe they were raised Christians, maybe they had a salvation experience, any of that kind of stuff, and they've started questioning, they've started realizing that it isn't actually what they thought it was.
Yes.
They're not. Some of them are now in church-sponsored deconstruction groups.
Yes.
Some of them have left the church but are meeting together just to talk through this thing, which is a fairly unique experience to them. People outside who didn't grow up in the church don't understand the trauma of leaving. That kind of anomie that comes from it. What is your message to them? Do you have them? I mean, that's a big thing to put on you, but if you could say something to them, what would it be?
Well, I suppose one thing I would say is, if one of the things you're trying to deconstruct is selfishness, where people only care about themselves, they just want to make sure they go to heaven and to hell with everybody else, Or they say, well, they can go to heaven with us if they just join our religion. But this sort of feeling like we're right, so it's tough that, if one of the things we're trying to do is grow beyond that sort of, I'm only worried about myself, then I think what would be smart for all of us to do is to take ourselves seriously, but not exclusively. So to say, I happen to grow up Mormon, or I happen to grow up Catholic, or I happen to grow up Baptist, or whatever it is. I grew up in some religion that has done me harm, and I have to now learn from that, grow from that. And the world, that's very important to me. But guess what? My friend is doing the same thing as a Hindu, and my other friend's doing the same thing as a Jew, and my other friend's doing the same thing as a Muslim, my other friend is an atheist. We're all dealing with this. And so I want to take my own growth seriously, and also be aware of my other friends who are in a very, very different story altogether. And I think if we can do that long enough, what it will do is it will make us say, is it possible that something is emerging in the human species around the world at this moment in history? And it will help us feel we're part of something much bigger. Because one of the dangers is to say, this institution is the problem. And if we could just fix it or get back at it or shut it down, everything would be fine. Everything would not be fine, Yeah.
Do we need reconstruction after the deconstruction or during?
Yeah. It's a good question. I'm always hesitant to speak of this, because when people say reconstruction, what they tend to mean is, I've got a few bad problems in my religious system. If I could just unscrew that bad eschatology element and unscrew that bad hell doctrine element and original sin element, and then I could screw something else in, I would have reconstructed and everything would be fine. But my honest feeling is our problems are so much deeper than this. And one of the things that we need to outgrow is the idea that we could ever have a system that's fine. And instead what we'd learn is to say, I'm a lifelong learner, and I want to live into that, being a lifelong learner and grower. And I'm part of a species that will never have it right, but that will constantly be learning and growing, and even bigger than the species. And I'm part of a planet that has a life that we participate in.
You've got a new book out. What is it called, and what can people expect from it?
Well, it's called Life After Doom, and the subtitle is Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart. I remember years ago someone said to me, speaking of climate change, if you're not overwhelmed, you don't understand the problem. And just about everybody gets educated to a point where they realize if I learn any more, I'm going to be overwhelmed. And so a lot of people step back. But more and more people can't step back. And they are moving into that place of feeling overwhelmed and paralyzed. And what they can expect from this book is I want to help people enter into the feeling of being overwhelmed, and not be overwhelmed by it. In other words, to say, okay, I'm going to learn how to face this and handle it and open myself to the possibilities that can come from facing it and growing through it. I say this because I have many friends who I think, and I feel this to myself to a degree, but I see friends who have been psychologically wounded by the despair that they feel. And giving cheap, easy answers will not solve their problem. So I want to help us all become resilient and have a deeper kind of hope that we were talking about before, to face these problems. Here's the way I say it. I don't know what the future holds. A lot of people want to foreclose. We're going to get through this. Everything will be fine. We're not going to get through this. We're doomed. Whatever this scenario is. I don't know what the future holds. I honestly don't think we can know. I think our human biases make us want to foreclose uncertainty because we have such a problem living with uncertainty. I don't know what the future holds. I know how I want to show up, and I hope it will help other people go through that process. Yeah.
Ryan, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure to be with you. I look forward to next time.
Absolutely. Hopefully you'll still want to talk to us.
I will.
After we came and tortured you on behalf of the Southern Baptists.
Yeah.
That's great.
Well, that's it. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Beer Christianity. We will be back shortly. We have one coming up with Dan McLaren. I don't know if you follow Dan McLaren on TikTok, but I do, and I love him, and I got to interview him recently. So we've got one of him coming up. We've got theologian Helen Painter coming up as well. There's a whole bunch of cool stuff there, but we have been a little bit radio silence just because we've been working so much on the magazine. So if you want to check out other Beer Christianity episodes, you can go to beerchristianity.co.uk. You can find us on most, podcasting platforms. You can email us to tell us what you think or suggest people to interview or, I don't know, just, give us your feedback at beerchristianity@yahoo.com. And do remember to go and visit Shibboleth Mag, SHIBBOLETH mag.com, and check out the magazine we've been working on, because there's a bit of it in there, but man, when you see the print, it's very cool. So anyway, thanks for listening, and bye!